The autumn of 1878 was a season of quiet dread in the high plains of the Nebraska Territory. It was a land of immense and often brutal beauty, where the sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas, and the horizon was a razor-sharp line that promised nothing but more of the same. The sun of late October had a deceptive warmth, a final, fleeting apology for the killing cold that was gathering its strength just beyond the northern rim of the world. Every settler felt it in their bones, a primal anxiety that hummed beneath the rhythms of the harvest. This was a time for accounting, for measuring the year's labor against the coming scarcity. Bins were filled with wheat, corn was shucked and stored, and the precious life-sustaining vegetables were brought in from the fields. The problem, the one that gnawed at the edges of every homesteader's peace, was not the harvest itself. The soil was generous, if you knew how to work it. The problem was time. Time was a thief, a relentless agent of decay that worked its slow, ruinous magic in the dark, damp spaces beneath their homes. Every family had a root cellar. It was the first thing a man dug after building his sod house or cabin, a shallow, earth-walled cavern designed to shield the harvest from the surface extremes. They were a simple, universal solution, and they were all, in their own way, failures. By January, the carrots would be limp and leathery, their sweetness turned to a woody memory. By February, the potatoes, stored in the suffocating dark, would begin to send out pale, desperate tendrils, consuming their own substance in a blind, futile reach for a sun that would not come. The apples would grow soft spots of brown rot that spread like a contagion, and the onions would turn to a pungent mush. To survive a winter on the plains was to learn to tolerate the taste of slow decay. It was the taste of compromise, of a battle fought and partially lost. The settlers accepted this as an unchangeable law of nature, another hardship to be endured with stoic resignation. They would lose a third of their stored food to rot, another portion to frost, and the rest would lose its vitality, becoming mere sustenance rather than nourishment. But in that autumn of 1878, one man looked at this universal problem and refused to accept the universal solution. His name was Josiah. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his movements and sparing with his words, a trait that often led others to mistake his thoughtfulness for slowness. He had come to farming late, having spent the better part of 2 decades as a well digger, a trade that had taught him more about the earth than any farmer could learn by scratching its surface. He understood the secrets of the deep soil, the language of its different layers of clay, sand, and stone. While his neighbors were reinforcing the thick sod roofs of their cellars and caulking the cracks in their doors, Josiah was doing something that, to any sane observer, looked like pure madness. He had chosen a spot on a slight rise near his cabin, and he had begun to dig. But he was not digging a wide, shallow pit for a cellar. He was digging a hole as a well digger would, a perfect circle, no more than 4 feet in diameter, plunging straight down into the earth. Day after day, through the golden light of October and into the gray chill of November, his neighbors watched him. They saw the growing mound of excavated earth. They saw the windlass and bucket he erected over the hole, a miniature version of a mining rig. They saw him descend into the darkness each morning and emerge each evening, covered in a fine dust of clay and grit. He was not digging a cellar. He was digging a well. But there was no water in that well, only a man with a singular, inexplicable purpose. The question whispered through the small community, at the general store, over fences, and in the pews of the small clapboard church. Why was Josiah digging a 30-foot hole in the ground? What could he possibly be thinking? It was a monumental waste of time and energy, a fool's errand on the very doorstep of winter. They called it Josiah's Folly, a name spoken first with puzzlement, then with pity, and finally with the kind of smug, head-shaking ridicule reserved for a man who has clearly taken leave of his senses. He was building a tomb for his harvest, they said, a pit of rot, a monument to his own stubborn strangeness. He was digging a grave, and the only thing he would bury in it was his family's chance of surviving the winter. Why was he digging a well to store his food? Why was he digging a well to store his food? You might be sitting there now, warm in your modern home, wondering the same thing. It seems illogical, counterintuitive, and a tremendous amount of work for a result that everyone around him was certain would be a catastrophic failure. We are so accustomed to our refrigerators and freezers, to the brute force of technology that bends nature to our will, that we have forgotten how to listen to nature itself, how to work with its fundamental principles instead of against them. If you are already intrigued by this forgotten piece of history, this story of a man who trusted the earth more than the accumulated wisdom of his entire community, do us a favor and hit that like button. It helps tell the great algorithm that stories of quiet innovation and forgotten genius are worth sharing. And if you haven't already, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we explore these kinds of stories every week. While you're at it, let us know in the comments, what's the most ingenious food storage trick you've ever heard of, or maybe one your grandparents used? It's a body of knowledge that is rapidly disappearing, and it's more valuable than you might think. Because the secret to Josiah's strange tower wasn't just about digging deep. It was about controlling the very air itself, a principle of physics that the so-called experts of his day had completely forgotten. He wasn't just building a hole, he was building a machine. A machine made of earth and stone and air, powered by the planet's own steady heartbeat. And you are going to want to see exactly how he did it, and how it saved more than just his own harvest. You're going to want to see how Josiah's folly became Josiah's fortune. To understand the genius of what Josiah was building, you first have to understand the man himself. He was not a farmer by instinct. His hands, though calloused and strong, did not hold the intimate knowledge of seeds and seasons that his neighbors possessed. His expertise lay not in the topsoil, but in everything beneath it. For 15 years, he had traveled the territory with a wagon, a set of augers, and a reputation for finding water where others found only dust. He was a dowser of a different sort. He didn't use a forked stick, he used his ears and his understanding of geology. He could read the subtle shifts in the land, the types of grasses that grew, the way the ground felt under his boots, and know where the life-giving aquifers lay hidden. More importantly, his work was a constant descent into the earth. He had spent countless hours suspended in the cool, silent darkness of a freshly dug shaft. He knew the distinct smell of different strata, the damp organic scent of the topsoil, giving way to the mineral sharpness of clay, the gritty dryness of sand, and the ancient cold smell of deep rock. But it was the temperature that had truly taught him the most. He knew from raw physical experience that the frantic temperature swings of the prairie surface were a thin veneer. On a blistering August day when the air above shimmered with heat, the world 30 feet below was refreshingly cool. And on a January morning when the wind could freeze a man's breath in his beard, that same depth was a place of surprising, steady mildness. The earth, he'd come to understand, was a massive thermal battery. It absorbed the sun's energy all summer and held it, releasing it slowly. It absorbed the winter's cold and buffered it. He had measured it. He knew that below a certain depth, around 12 to 15 feet, the seasonal fluctuations vanished, smoothed out into a single constant temperature. That temperature was the average of all the seasons, the true steady temperature of the land itself. In this part of Nebraska, that temperature was a consistent 52 degrees Fahrenheit. While his neighbors saw their root cellars as holes to keep the frost out, Josiah saw the problem differently. Their cellars were too shallow. At 6 or 8 feet deep, they were still caught in the zone of seasonal influence. An unseasonably warm autumn could keep the cellar too warm, encouraging potatoes to sprout and bacteria to multiply. A brutally cold winter, like the one everyone feared was coming, could drive the frost line down past the cellar's floor, freezing everything solid. They were fighting a constant battle with the surface, a battle of insulation, of piling more dirt and straw on top, a battle they always, eventually, lost. The second problem he observed was humidity. He'd seen it in his own small conventional cellar the year before. The air was either too damp or too dry. In the dampness, a fine black mold would creep over the squash, and the apples would develop a bitter rot. When the air was too dry, the carrots and beets would go limp, their internal moisture wicked away into the thirsty air, leaving them shriveled and tough. His neighbors would place buckets of water in their cellars to add moisture or trays of lime to absorb it, a constant, clumsy adjustment that rarely found the right balance. The third problem was the air itself. It was stagnant. A root cellar was a sealed box, and the air within it grew stale and heavy. Josiah knew from his own harvest that ripening fruit, especially apples, gave off a gas. He didn't know its name was ethylene, but he knew its effect. It was an invisible signal of ripeness that in a closed space would trigger a chain reaction, causing everything else to ripen and rot prematurely. Stagnant air also meant condensation. When warmer, moist air met the cold cellar walls, water would bead up and drip, creating a perfect environment for mildew and decay. Josiah's design was meant to solve all three of these problems, not by fighting them, but by harnessing a deeper, more stable, natural system. He was going past the zone of conflict, down into the zone of constancy. The construction itself was a marvel of simple, practical engineering. The 30-foot shaft was the heart of it. He lined the entire depth with fieldstones, fitted together without mortar. This wasn't just for structural stability. The stone lining served a critical purpose. It acted as a thermal conductor, pulling the steady temperature from the surrounding 30 feet of earth and radiating it into the central column. It also provided a huge surface area that would act as a natural humidity buffer. Inside this stone-lined shaft, he began to build the tower. It was a central column made of rough-sawn timber, a square pillar running from the bottom almost to the top. Into this pillar, he drove thick wooden pegs, staggered on all four sides. These pegs would support a series of round, slatted shelves, like wide wooden donuts that could be slid down over the central pillar to rest on the pegs. He had also woven large, shallow baskets from willow branches, which could be hung from the pegs in place of the shelves. This allowed for maximum air circulation around every single piece of produce. Nothing would be piled in bins to trap moisture and heat. But the true genius of the system, the part that no one watching him could possibly have understood, was the ventilation. He procured 2 long sections of stovepipe. The first he ran from the surface down the outside of the stone lining, with the pipe's opening emerging at the very bottom of the shaft, a foot from the floor. This was his air intake. The second pipe was much shorter. Its opening was positioned near the very top of the shaft, just below the insulated cap he had built. This was the exhaust. He was creating a natural chimney, a passive engine driven by the laws of thermodynamics. He knew that cold air is dense and heavy, while warmer air is lighter and rises. The deep earth would keep the air inside the tower at a constant 52 degrees. On a cold winter day, the outside air might be 10 degrees, or 0, or 20 below 0. This cold, heavy air would naturally fall down the intake pipe, pooling at the bottom of the shaft. As it entered the tower, it would begin to be warmed by the stone walls. As it warmed, it would also pick up a microscopic amount of moisture from the damp earth, reaching the perfect humidity level. This now slightly warmer, more humid, and therefore lighter air would begin to rise slowly, like a gentle, invisible river, flowing up past all the shelves of vegetables and fruits. It would carry away any ethylene gas, any excess moisture, any hint of stagnation. By the time it reached the top of the tower, it would be warmer and lighter than the air at the bottom, and it would flow effortlessly out the exhaust vent. This constant, slow, silent cycle of air replacement would run all day and all night, with no moving parts, no fuel, and no intervention. It was a living, breathing system, perfectly synchronized with the deep, steady rhythm of the earth. He had not built a tomb. He had built a lung that would provide his harvest with a constant supply of perfectly chilled, perfectly humidified, perfectly fresh air, all winter long. He was creating an isolated, ideal microclimate 30 feet below the chaos of the prairie winter. It was a solution of such profound elegance and simplicity that the men who mocked him with their shallow, stagnant, rotting cellars simply could not comprehend it. They saw a man digging a hole. He saw a machine for defeating time. The community's reaction was swift and merciless. It began as idle curiosity, but as Josiah's hole grew deeper and the nature of his project remained stubbornly obscure, puzzlement curdled into suspicion and then into open ridicule. The prairie was a place that valued conformity and proven methods. Survival was too precarious to allow for reckless experimentation. A man's duty was to his family, and that meant following the hard-won wisdom of those who had come before. To deviate was not just eccentric, it was irresponsible. At Miller's General Store, the unofficial heart of the community, Josiah's folly was the main topic of conversation. Men leaned against the counter, nursing cups of coffee, and offered their unflattering assessments. 30 feet, one farmer scoffed, shaking his head. What's he aim to do, lower his wife down on a rope to fetch a potato for supper? Heard from my boy he's lining it with stone, another added, wasting good stone that could be used for a proper foundation. He's building a silo underground. A silo for mold. The store owner, a man named Henderson who saw himself as a barometer of public opinion, summed it up. The man was a fine well digger. He should have stuck to it. He knows the earth all right, but he knows nothing about keeping a crop. He's confusing one for the other, and his family will pay the price for it come February. The children picked up on the adults' mockery, as children do. They would sometimes creep to the edge of Josiah's property and chant, "Josiah's deep, his mind is gone. He'll eat his boots before the dawn," before running away, squealing with laughter. The social pressure was immense, a constant low-grade humiliation that followed Josiah and his family everywhere they went. At the Sunday church service, he could feel the weight of his neighbors' stares. The minister delivered a sermon on the sin of pride, on the folly of men who believe they can devise better ways than those proven by generations. And though he never mentioned Josiah by name, every soul in that small wooden building knew who he was talking about. The voice of this collective disapproval soon found its champion in Mr. Abernathy. Arthur Abernathy was the most successful man in the county, a fact he never tired of reinforcing. He owned the largest tract of land, had the biggest barn, and his house was the only one in the vicinity with 2 stories and glass windows in every room. He was a man of loud opinions and unshakable self-confidence. His own root cellar was a source of immense pride. It was a massive stone-arched cavern dug into the side of a hill with thick oak doors and a sophisticated-looking, but ultimately useless, hand-cranked ventilation fan. He considered himself an expert on all things related to farming and construction, and he saw Josiah's project as a personal affront to his authority. He chose to make his condemnation public. One afternoon, he rode his horse directly to Josiah's property, dismounting with an air of grave importance. Josiah was at the windlass, preparing to descend into the shaft to set the final stones. Abernathy didn't bother with pleasantries. "Josiah," he boomed, his voice carrying across the yard. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. As a leader in this community, I feel it is my duty to tell you for your own good that you are building a death trap for your food." Josiah paused, his hands on the rope. He looked at Abernathy, his face impassive. He said nothing. Abernathy, accustomed to commanding attention, was irritated by the silence. "Do you not understand basic principles, man? You are creating a column of cold, wet air. It will stagnate. The damp will rise, and everything you put down there will turn to black slime by Christmas. It's a pit of contagion. You are actively cultivating rot." He gestured dismissively at the neat pile of stovepipe sections. "And this nonsense? A child's toy. You think that will move air 30 feet down? You need force. You need engineering." He puffed out his chest slightly. "Like the system I designed for my cellar." Josiah finally spoke, his voice low and calm, containing no trace of anger or defensiveness. "The earth will keep it at 52 degrees, Mr. Abernathy, and the air will move itself." Abernathy laughed, a short barking sound of derision. 52 degrees of wet rot. You are a stubborn fool, Josiah. Mark my words. When your family is starving in February while mine is eating crisp apples from my cellar, perhaps you will learn the cost of your pride. I am telling you now, fill in this hole before you waste your entire harvest on this fantasy." He turned without waiting for a reply, mounted his horse, and rode off, confident that he had delivered a decisive and necessary rebuke. The encounter left a heavy silence in its wake. The personal stakes of Josiah's project were now starkly clear. His wife, Mary, had been watching from the cabin window. She came out onto the porch, her expression etched with worry. She was a practical woman who trusted her husband's judgment implicitly, but the relentless scorn of their neighbors was wearing her down. She feared not for the harvest, but for him, for the isolation he was bringing upon himself, and for the shame they would all face if he was wrong. "Josiah," she said softly, her voice barely carrying on the wind, "Mr. Abernathy is an influential man. He has turned everyone against us." Josiah walked over to her and took her hands. They were cold. "He is a loud man, Mary. That is not the same as being a wise one." "But what if he is right?" she whispered, the fear she had been holding back finally surfacing. "What if it all spoils? The children. We have so little to spare. We cannot afford a mistake of this magnitude." Josiah looked from her worried face to the dark, circular opening of his tower. His expression was not one of pride or defiance, but of a deep, quiet certainty. It was the certainty of a man who had spent hundreds of hours in the silent, steady embrace of the deep earth. He was not gambling. He was not guessing. He was applying a law of nature he understood as surely as he understood the sun would rise in the morning. He squeezed her hands gently. "Time will tell, Mary," he said, echoing the words he had spoken to Abernathy. "The winter will be the judge. Now I have work to finish." He turned and walked back to the windlass. He did not argue. He did not shout. He did not rush to defend his theories with words against the loud certainties of other men. He simply checked the knot on the rope, lit the lantern he would hang from his belt, and began his slow descent back into the silent, waiting earth. He would let the results of his labor be his only argument. His resolve was as deep and as unshakable as the hole he was digging. The winter came not as a gradual decline, but as an assault. It began in mid-December with a blizzard that the old-timers would later call the Great White Hurricane. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world vanished into a screaming, swirling vortex of snow. The wind howled with a predatory fury, sculpting drifts as high as houses and scouring the landscape clean of any feature or landmark. When it finally ended, it was replaced by a silence that was even more menacing. A dome of Arctic high pressure settled over the plains, and the temperature plummeted into a realm of profound, dangerous cold. For weeks it did not rise above 0. At night, the mercury in the few thermometers in the territory shrank to 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below. It was a dry, crystalline cold that seemed to leach the very life out of the air. Trees in the small wooded groves cracked open with sounds like rifle shots. The snow, once soft, became a hard, granular crust that squeaked underfoot. It was a cold that felt ancient and absolute, a force that sought to penetrate every barrier, to find and extinguish every pocket of warmth. They would call it the Winter of the Iron Freeze, a name that perfectly captured the unyielding, metallic hardness of the cold. In the first weeks, the community's conventional root cellars held. They were designed for a normal winter, and they performed as expected. But this was not a normal winter. The iron freeze was relentless, driving the frost line deeper into the earth than anyone had ever seen. The 6 or 8 feet of packed earth and sod that topped the cellars were no longer enough. The cold began to creep in. The first signs of failure were subtle. A farmer would go to his cellar and find a thin layer of frost on the north-facing wall. Then, the potatoes stored in the bins nearest that wall were found to be hard as rocks. The news spread in hushed, worried tones. People began to move their stores away from the walls, piling them in the center of their cellars, covering them with extra blankets and straw. It was a desperate losing battle against a silent, invading army of frost. Arthur Abernathy, in his magnificent arched cellar, was at first smugly confident. His walls were thick stone, his roof piled high with earth. But even his fortress was not immune. The sheer, prolonged intensity of the cold began to breach his defenses. He found a barrel of his prized apples, the ones he had boasted about, frozen solid. When they thawed, they turned to a brown, cider-smelling mush. Panic began to set in. The great man's cellar, the symbol of his foresight and superiority, was failing him. Then came the false thaw. For 2 days, a warm wind blew from the south, and the temperature miraculously rose to just above freezing. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the relief was a trap. Inside the cold-soaked cellars, the warmer, moist air caused condensation to form everywhere. The stone walls wept, The wooden bins grew slick with moisture, and a damp, clammy feeling filled the air. The thaw lasted just long enough to introduce the second great enemy of preservation: wetness. Then, just as quickly, the Arctic air returned and the iron freeze clamped down again, harder than before. This time, the results were catastrophic. The moisture that had condensed on the vegetables and fruits now froze, rupturing their cellular walls. The harvest was transformed into a collection of icy, ruined pulp. Carrots, potatoes, turnips, all were destroyed. What wasn't frozen was now sitting in a damp, mold-friendly environment. The smell of decay began to permeate the cellars. By mid-January, the grim reality was undeniable. Across the settlement, families were facing the catastrophic loss of their winter food supply. Abernathy, it was rumored, had lost over half of his crop. Others, less prepared, had lost nearly everything. The winter of the iron freeze was becoming a winter of hunger. Throughout this ordeal, Josiah's routine remained unchanged. Each day, he would walk the short distance from his cabin to the small, insulated wooden cap that covered the entrance to his root tower. He would heave the heavy lid open, and a small, barely visible wisp of air would rise from the opening. It was not the frigid, biting air of the surface, but a cool, clean, earth-scented vapor. He would lower a large basket on a simple rope and pulley system, wait a moment, and then begin to haul it up. His family did not just survive, they thrived. Their cabin was filled with the rich smells of roasting potatoes, of hearty vegetable stews, of baked apples dusted with cinnamon. While their neighbors were rationing shriveled, frost-bitten produce, the food on Josiah's table was as fresh and vibrant as the day it was harvested. He would bring up a carrot from the tower, its color a deep, healthy orange. He would snap it in two, and the sound would be a sharp, clean crack, releasing a sweet, earthy aroma. The potatoes were firm and white, their skins smooth and unbroken, with not a single sprout. The apples were crisp, their skins taut, and when bitten into, they gushed with cool, sweet juice. He had lost nothing. Not a single vegetable to frost, not a single apple to rot. The tower was performing exactly as he had designed it to. The 30 feet of earth acted as an impenetrable shield against the iron freeze. The constant 52-degree air, maintained by the geothermal warmth, was the perfect temperature. The natural convection system pulled the deadly frigid air down, warmed it, humidified it, and circulated it in a gentle, life-preserving breath before exhaling it harmlessly. His folly was a resounding, unmitigated success. By early February, the situation in the wider community had grown dire. Abernathy's pride had been frozen, thawed, and shattered along with his harvest. His own family was on short rations, and the respect he had always commanded from his neighbors had evaporated, replaced by a shared sense of fear and desperation. He had been the expert, the one with the answers, and his answers had been disastrously wrong. The quiet, stubborn fool whom he had publicly ridiculed was, by all accounts, eating well. The irony was as bitter as the winter wind. Finally, driven by a combination of genuine need and a gnawing, unbearable curiosity, Abernathy swallowed the hard stone of his pride. He saddled his horse and rode through the deep, squeaking snow to Josiah's homestead. He had no plan, no speech prepared. He was a man adrift, seeking a landmark in a world that no longer made sense. He found Josiah splitting firewood near the cabin. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a sound of normalcy in a world that felt deeply abnormal. Josiah saw him coming and stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He waited. Abernathy dismounted, his movements stiff from the cold and from the awkwardness of his mission. "Josiah," he began, his voice rough, "the winter has been harsh." It was a colossal understatement. Josiah simply nodded. He offered no greeting, but also no reproach. "My stores," Abernathy's voice faltered. "I've suffered significant losses. The frost, then the damp." He couldn't bring himself to detail the full extent of the catastrophe in his own cellar. "I was wondering," he finally managed, "if I might see it." He didn't have to say what it was. There was only one thing it could be. Josiah looked at the proud, broken man standing before him. He saw no triumph in Abernathy's humiliation. He simply saw a neighbor in need. He gave another slow nod and gestured with his head toward the tower. Come." He led the way. The snow around the tower's cap was untrodden except for Josiah's own single path. He lifted the heavy lid. Abernathy peered into the darkness, expecting a blast of frigid air, the smell of rot and mold he had so confidently predicted. Instead, he was met by a gentle puff of cool, clean air that smelled faintly of damp stone and fresh apples. It was the smell of life. Josiah worked the pulley, lowering the empty basket down into the shaft. The rope played out, down, down, down into the silent dark. Abernathy listened, trying to imagine the conditions 30 feet below. After a moment, Josiah began to haul the rope back up, hand over hand, his movements steady and unhurried. The basket emerged from the darkness and into the pale winter light. It was laden with produce that looked like it had been pulled from the ground only yesterday. Abernathy stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be possible. There were large, perfectly formed potatoes, their skins dusty but firm. There were carrots, their green tops still attached and only slightly wilted, and nestled among them were a half-dozen red apples, their skins gleaming as if polished, without a single blemish or soft spot. Josiah set the basket down in the snow. He said nothing. He simply waited. Abernathy knelt, his expensive leather gloves feeling clumsy and inadequate. He reached out and picked up a potato. It was cool to the touch but not cold. It was heavy, solid. He turned it over and over in his hands. He ran his thumb over its smooth skin. He then picked up a carrot, holding it as if it were a precious artifact. He could feel its crispness, its density. It was not the limp, rubbery thing he was used to seeing in his own cellar. This was a vegetable brimming with life and nourishment. He looked from the perfect vegetables in his hands to the dark opening of the shaft, and then to Josiah's calm, patient face. In that moment, the full crushing weight of his own ignorance descended upon him. All his theories, all his confident pronouncements, all his carefully constructed expertise, it was all worthless dust in the face of this simple, profound reality. He had lectured about brute force and engineering, while Josiah had listened to the quiet, subtle wisdom of the earth. He had built a fortress against nature, and nature had breached it with ease. Josiah had built a partnership with nature, and nature had rewarded him with abundance. I was wrong," Abernathy said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The words seemed to cost him a great deal, but they were uttered with the unmistakable clarity of a man who has had his entire worldview dismantled and reassembled in the span of a few minutes. "Josiah, I was a fool, a complete and utter fool. I do not understand how this is possible." Josiah looked at the humbled man, and for the first time his expression softened. "It is possible," he said quietly, "because the earth below is more constant than the sky above, and the air wants to move. You just have to show it the way." He picked an apple from the basket and handed it to Abernathy. "For your family," he said. It was not an act of charity, nor of pity. It was an offering of knowledge, a simple gesture that acknowledged their shared struggle against the harshness of the land. It was the beginning of a profound shift, not just for one man, but for the entire community. When the iron freeze finally broke and a weak spring sun began to melt the colossal snowdrifts, the full accounting of the winter's toll could be made. The stories that emerged were grim. Some families had lost nearly their entire harvest, surviving on little more than flour and salted meat. The community was weakened, facing a hungry spring with little seed potato to plant for the coming year. The collective loss was staggering, a testament to the brutal power of the prairie winter and the inadequacy of their traditional methods. Against this backdrop of widespread failure, Josiah's success was not just remarkable, it was statistically miraculous. When he finally emptied his root tower to prepare for the new season, he took a careful inventory. He had stored nearly 1,000 pounds of produce in the autumn. What he took out in the spring was virtually identical. A few apples had begun to soften, and a handful of potatoes had started to show the smallest signs of sprouting. He calculated his total spoilage at less than 5%. In stark contrast, Mr. Abernathy, after a painful and honest assessment of his own celebrated cellar, calculated his losses at nearly 70%. Others in the community reported figures ranging from 40 to 80%. The numbers told an undeniable story. Josiah's folly was, by any objective measure, the most effective, most efficient, and most successful food preservation system anyone had ever seen. It had performed perfectly under the most extreme test imaginable. The data was the irrefutable proof, but it was Arthur Abernathy's transformation that truly turned the tide of public opinion. He had been the system's loudest critic, and he now became its most fervent evangelist. At the first town meeting held that spring in the drafty church hall, Abernathy stood before his neighbors. The usual bluster and arrogance were gone, replaced by a deep and sincere humility that was far more powerful. He did not make excuses. He did not deflect blame. He looked his neighbors in the eye and spoke with the force of a convert. "For years," he began, his voice steady, "I have offered my advice as an expert. This winter has taught me that I was an expert in the wrong things. I told you all that my cellar was the model of modern design. I was wrong. I told you that Josiah's work was the project of a fool. I have never been more wrong in my entire life." A murmur went through the crowd. "I called his creation Josiah's folly," Abernathy continued, his gaze finding Josiah, who sat quietly in the back row with his wife. "I was the fool. While we were all fighting the winter, he was ignoring it. He went deeper. He found a place of constancy that we, in our shallow thinking, never considered. He wasn't digging a well for his food. He was listening to the earth, and it told him a secret we had all forgotten, or perhaps never even knew." He then described what he had seen that day at Josiah's homestead. He described the crispness of the carrots, the firmness of the potatoes, the perfect, unspoiled gleam of the apples in the dead of February. He spoke not just of the results, but of the principles he now understood: the steady geothermal temperature, the natural humidity, and the brilliant simplicity of the passive air circulation. "He built a machine that breathes," Abernathy concluded, his voice filled with awe. "And it saved his family. That same knowledge can save all of us. I, for one, will be digging a new cellar this summer. It will not be wide and it will not be shallow. It will be a tower, and I will be asking Josiah's permission to learn from his design." That speech marked the turning point. The intellectual and social redemption was complete. The ridicule that had plagued Josiah vanished overnight, replaced by a wave of respect and intense curiosity. The name Josiah's Folly was never spoken again. Instead, people began to refer to the design as a Josiah well, or more commonly, a sustenance tower. That summer, the rhythmic sound of shovels hitting earth could be heard all across the settlement, but the holes being dug were different now. They were narrow, circular shafts. Men who had once mocked Josiah now came to his homestead, hat in hand, not to offer apologies, but to ask for guidance. They brought measuring tapes and notebooks. Josiah, true to his nature, was a quiet and patient teacher. He shared his knowledge freely, without any hint of pride or vindication. He explained the critical importance of depth, insisting that 25 feet was the minimum, but 30 was better. He showed them how to line the shaft with stone to maximize thermal transfer. He detailed the precise placement of the intake and exhaust vents to ensure proper convection. He became an unlikely sage, an innovator whose quiet persistence had fundamentally changed the calculus of survival for his entire community. The legacy of Josiah's root tower spread far beyond that single settlement. Travelers and traders saw the strange-looking structures with their 2 stovepipe vents and asked about them. The story of the winter of the iron freeze and the one man whose harvest had survived it became a local legend, and the principles behind the tower were carried to other parts of the territory and beyond. The design was adapted and refined. Some used clay pipes instead of stovepipes, others lined their shafts with brick. But the core principles, deep earth thermal stability and passive air circulation, remained the same. The long-term impact on the health and security of these frontier communities was profound. With a reliable method for preserving the nutritional value of their vegetables, the devastating winter ailments brought on by malnutrition, like scurvy, became far less common. Families could face the winter not with dread, but with confidence. The sustenance tower gave them a buffer against the unpredictability of the climate, a real measure of food security that had been previously unimaginable. It was a low-cost, low-technology solution that was vastly superior to the methods it replaced. It was a perfect example of how an elegant, nature-based design could outperform a more complicated brute force approach. The principles Josiah harnessed are the same ones now being explored in modern sustainable architecture and engineering: geothermal heating and cooling, passive ventilation, and building systems that work in harmony with their natural environment rather than in opposition to it. His simple tower was, in its own way, a bridge between the forgotten wisdom of the past and the most advanced thinking about the future. The story of Josiah's root tower is a powerful reminder that the most revolutionary ideas are often the simplest. They don't always come from the recognized experts or the centers of power. More often, they come from a quiet observer on the periphery, someone with a different background, a different perspective, who sees a common problem and has the courage to question the common solution. Josiah's neighbors saw a hole in the ground. He saw a system. They saw a man wasting his time. He saw an investment in a fundamental principle. They trusted the flawed wisdom of the crowd, while he placed his trust in the immutable laws of physics and the deep, steady wisdom of the earth. True innovation is often not about inventing something entirely new, but about rediscovering something ancient and essential that has been overlooked. It's about having the humility to observe how the natural world solves its own problems and the ingenuity to adapt those solutions to our own needs. Josiah's triumph was not just a victory over a harsh winter. It was a victory for a different way of thinking. It was a testament to quiet resolve, methodical work, and the unshakable belief in an idea that runs contrary to the prevailing consensus. It teaches us that sometimes, to find the most stable ground, you have to be willing to dig a little deeper than everyone else. If this journey back in time has given you a new appreciation for the kind of old wisdom that can still teach us so much today, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. We believe these stories of practical genius are more than just entertainment. They are a vital part of our shared history that deserves to be remembered and understood. Now we want to hear from you. What modern convenience do you think is actually less effective than an older, simpler method? Whether it's in the kitchen, the garden, or the workshop, let us know in the comments below. Your insights are a huge part of what makes this community so valuable. The preceding story is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. The characters, specific events, and locations are products of imagination. However, the underlying technical principles of using deep earth thermal stability, natural humidity control, and passive ventilation, the chimney effect, for food preservation are based on real historical practices and established principles of physics and thermodynamics. These methods were used in various forms, such as deep root cellars and ice houses, throughout history. The application of these principles in a modern context requires consultation with qualified professionals, such as engineers and architects, and must adhere to all local building codes, safety regulations, and environmental laws. Do not attempt to construct such a structure without proper guidance and permits.